Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm here for episode 2 of the Casual Stream. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals where you can get updates on content that I'm producing here, guest appearances that I make on other channels, as well as contribute to the channel directly and engage with the channel directly. For example, making recommendations for future episodes of Casual Stream or any other series that I'm doing. So the other thing is seeing who's here. Hello, Vingel. Hello, Gigi Hacks. Hello, Ori Samsonov. Hello, Minoan. And hello, RLDWPHPZA. So one thing we'll do is we'll sort of let people trickle in first before we really get rolling on this. But just sort of as a expanding on the platform here, I'll probably go like 45, 50 minutes and then engage with the chat. If you want to make sure that I read your comments, I'll read super chats first. And then after that, I'll see what other chats are of interest or relevant to the discussion to sort of boost engagement. I see we have Tricky Woo. Hello. So just as a brief sort of setting things up and again, waiting for people to come in, there was a tweet from Academic Agent a few days ago where he was either responding to or advocating for, I don't really remember what, but the sort of neo-pagan attitude that's rooted in a kind of Nietzschian reading of the Bronze Age. So what we might call the Greek Age of heroes, Homerism, Homeric, the heroes of like Heracles and Theseus and so on and so forth. Hello, John Comanus. And saying that that's, this more vitalistic, life-affirming masculinist position and, echoing a certain reading of Nietzsche that the philosophers and at least the Socratic and beyond philosophers, as well as Christianity, specifically from Paul on, is not this. And, I've heard this a lot. I've heard this generally, most of my life. And the thing is, it's just not true. And the fact of the matter is that if you look at, say, Homer, who writes the Iliad and the Odyssey, Virgil, who he's writing in the 1st century BC, but he's writing about Bronze Age events, the fall of Troy from the Trojan perspective, the Aeneid, Sophocles, and others, we basically see that if we look at these accounts of the heroic age and the heroes of themselves, what is the sort of moral answer? What is the moral case being made? Is it a moral case that's radically different from what we would find in Plato and Christianity? Now, what I'm not saying is that they're all basically the same in this kind of like strong P perennialism that you might see a Freemason like Manly P. Hall make. That's not true. There are differences. But the differences, I would argue, are the result of ratiocination of basic ethical concepts over millennia that we first see written down with Homer and the classical Greeks describing Bronze Age Greece leading up to the Christian era and beyond. And so let's sort of start with this. Let's look at the Iliad, right? So one argument is, it's about a war. Yeah, it is about a war, but is it the same sort of like gung-ho, harem scarum, smash and grab, take all the women that we sort of see with the neo-pagans, or more specifically, Robert Howard's Conan the Barbarian? Well, we do see that, but it's not really something that leads to good outcomes. So just for example, in the lead up to the Iliad, so the Iliad itself is one portion of a broader set of epic poems about the Trojan War, many of which are lost. And the Iliad is one of the most famous because it is one that has been preserved and has so many memorable characters. But leading up to the Iliad, Agamemnon, in order to stay the complaints of other Greeks who say that, well, you won't lose anything on this expedition. Why should we forfeit our lives and our wealth to go save Helen from the Trojans? Well, he sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia, which in the long run does not end well for him because his wife Clytemnestra, when he returns from Troy, ends up conspiring with her lover to kill him. And then she's in turn killed by her son, Agamemnon's son. And so we see that this sort of brutal negotiation with the other Greek kings is something that really blows up in Agamemnon's face. And this idea of using martial strength to the exclusion of all other considerations. Again, this kind of Conan, Robert Howard mentality is not something that we find ending well or being rewarded in the Iliad. So, for example, the Iliad begins with the rage of Achilles. And Achilles is mad because, well, to sort of set the stage for this, at the beginning of it, Chryseis, the daughter of Chrysis and a priest of Apollo, is taken as a war prize, and he demands that she be ransomed. And they initially deny that. Agamemnon, the chief of the Greeks, initially denies that. And so Apollo then curses them with a plague, only being released after she's returned to her father. But in part, he's mad. Agamemnon is angry at Achilles for siding with Apollo in this, and steals one of his war captives, Briseis, who's a female slave. And so that leads to the entire fight between Achilles and Agamemnon. And Achilles then is deaf to the complaints of all the other Greeks in this war while they're getting slaughtered by Hector. Until, of course, he loses his beloved Patroclus, his cousin and kinsman. So what we see here is a couple things. One is that the anger of Achilles, when it is finally released on Hector and he's desecrated his corpse, doesn't actually bring peace and satisfaction to Achilles. Achilles only finds satisfaction and contentment once he gives up his wrath and anger, listens to the will of the gods, where Mercury sends Priam secretly into the camp to beg for Hector's body and to allow funeral rites. So only after giving up this sort of barbarian rage is Achilles sort of giving this cathartic release from the loss of his friend Patroclus, which again, you don't see that at all with this sort of neo-pagan reading and this sort of understanding of Conan the Barbarian and so on and so on. The other thing that we see with this concept of, for example, another thing that you'll see is Conan and others, characters that are derivative of him, will be seen taking the most beautiful women for themselves, and there's no consequence. Well, there's actually plenty of consequences in real life, and Homer points that out. You know, you might offend the gods, they might send you a plague, you might piss off your greatest warrior, Achilles, and all sorts of terrible things happen. You know, you might come home and your wife kills you. So there are consequences to this, to these actions. And of course, one can argue that when Nestor confronts Achilles and Agamemnon at the beginning of the book, saying that, you know, you should just sort this out and listen to my advice because your fathers would have listened to me. I'm the wise counselor of Greece. That he's the voice of reason. He represents reason, and Agamemnon represents acquisitiveness. And in part, we know this because when Menelaus duels with Paris, he basically says to himself, no matter who wins, even if it's Menelaus, we're still going to sack Troy. We still want to get all that treasure. So really, from Agamemnon's perspective, Menelaus's complaint was a means to an end, not the actual end itself. And Achilles is just, you know, the rage of Achilles. So rage and acquisitiveness are butting up, and the good wisdom of Nestor is ignored. Again, this sort of like without limits expression of desire and rage and acquisitiveness and lust backfires tremendously for the Greeks. Furthermore, if we get to the end of the Trojan War itself, I forget which one of the Ajaxes, but one of the Ajaxes goes into the temple of Athena and ravishes Cassandra, which then pisses off Athena, and she sinks half the Greek fleet as they return home. Many Greeks don't return home. One of the few that does is Diomedes, and some that do get killed, like Agamemnon. Menelaus also returns home. And, you know, Ulysses is lost for 10 years. Before the death of Patroclus, Achilles also threatens to leave back to Greece, back to his homeland, and abandon the entire cause. He says, what wrong have the Trojans done me? Well, he'll later answer that later after they kill Patroclus. But the issue is he sees that this is a pointless war. This is a war that he doesn't have a stake in, which again doesn't really sort of mesh with this attitude. It almost sounds contemporary, especially when you look at the critics of the war in Vietnam and the critics of the war in the Middle East, you know, Afghanistan and Iraq. What cause do we have over here? And then we also see that with the Greek writers, while they certainly believed the gods were real, they also represented certain insights and strengths and powers. So Athena represents wisdom, and Apollo represents knowledge. And twice in the Iliad, once in the mouth of Athena and once in the mouth of Apollo, they confront Ares and claim that he is the bane of man. So if wisdom and insight, or wisdom and knowledge, claim that war is a bane, and ultimately these are the two gods that help Ulysses get back home to Ithaca, that should give you some pause, right? Because why is Homer saying that? Now, obviously, with the Iliad and Homer's work, there is a wide range of interpretation. In fact, right, with the Aeneid and the Divine Comedy, Virgil and Dante flip the script and make the Trojans the good guys. So, of course, yes, there's lots of room for interpretation. You could argue there's no one canonical interpretation, but I do think that there are clues left by Homer as to what he sort of sees as the right thing to do. And so, for example, Nestor saying that you should, limit your passions, think this through. He's the one that we should be listening to. This is the one that sort of represents Homer's perspective on this particular issue, this problem. Don't let it get out of hand. Both Achilles and Agamemnon let it get out of hand to their ruin. And so the other thing is the hubris of Achilles, his unweaning pride, leads to him going out in a pretty humiliating way. Apollo conspires with Paris to have him killed. And so, again, this is part of it's this duality, right? Achilles was like, well, I could live a short life with glory or a long life and die in peace. But of course, what does him in is his own character flaws. Whereas, again, I always go back to Conan because it's kind of a cartoon. I mean, this is a cartoon. There's no consequences to anything that he does. He can just kind of act in an impulsive way without any consequences. But what Homer shows us is there are consequences. Now, if we move to the Odyssey, we see Homer go even further. So when Telemachus goes to Sparta to meet Menelaus in order to inquire of his father, Odysseus, who he's heard from, I think it's Athena, who said that his father is going to return in secret, he goes to Sparta. And he says, at first he's joined with Athena in disguise as another prince, and he meets one of the stewards, and he says, the steward goes back to Agamemnon and says, well, should we let them in? And he's like, well, he's royalty. He's a friend of my friend Ulysses, and we would never have gotten back from Troy if other kings and princes had not shown us hospitality and kindness. And he's like, of course you should show this to Telemachus, even if you weren't the son of Ulysses. He also says that he would give up a third of his wealth and Helen to undo the entire Trojan War and have his friends back, the great princes of Greece who died in the war. And he says that the treasures and the woman that he got were not worth their loss. So again, something that you're not going to find with this sort of neo-pagan attitude. Now, the idea of hospitality, we find that, of course, in the Bible. The idea is that Sodom and Gomorrah was punished for lack of hospitality. We see this in Genesis, where they try to ravish the angelic messengers that go to Lot. So again, we find a consistent moral principle here. And of course, the greater philosophers like Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, as well as the development of Christian theology with Paul, they also would adhere to that. So there's consistency here. We also see that Ulysses, when he goes to the Phocians and gives his case of being the most unfortunate man alive, says that Zeus is the protector of strangers and the punisher of evil. And we find a very similar statement in Psalms, where God, Yahweh, is the protector of strangers, the weak, and the orphans, and the punisher of evil. Well, okay. Well, that's interesting. This is in the mouth of a Homeric hero. To a king, he's asking for supplication. So again, this kind of concern for those that are lower and more vulnerable is one that would be accused in this derisive sense of being Christian or whatever. And it's like, no, it's in Homer. This is not something that is completely discontinuous with what later comes on in the Western tradition. We also can look at the age of heroes as described by Sophocles. So in the Oedipal cycle, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Callana, and Antigone, we also see virtues and values that are consistent with Christianity and the philosophical tradition. So, for example, incest is condemned. He's cursed by the gods to murder his father and sleep with his mother. So patricide and incest are condemned, which, again, everybody else would have condemned later on as well. That's something that's beyond the pale. And in some sense, in Oedipus at Colonna, Oedipus has to come to terms with the ruling of the gods in his life. And once he comes to terms with that, he then is able to find some sort of catharsis and redemption, which again is an arc that seems pretty similar to what Christians talk about, the idea that you have to come to terms with God's sovereign will in your life, and only then can you move on. So again, this is not a completely discontinuous concept. We see an Antigonus of Colonna, Oedipus at Colonna and Antigone, that his daughter Antigone represents many virtues and values that we would find in the Christian tradition. The idea that you should honor your father, in this case, Oedipus, who's blind and lost his kingdom and wandering around. And it's 20 years after the events at Oedipus Rex. So basically, Antigone is essentially forfeiting the best years of her life, which she could start a family with, in order to fulfill filial piety to her blind father, while her two brothers and her sister really don't. So again, that's something that we would find in Christianity. And then in Antigone, she buries her dead brother, who died in a civil war, even against the wishes of her uncle Creon, who then has her killed. And again, she says, well, should I obey the gods or the will of a man? Very much like the apostles in Acts saying, we should obey God rather than man. Now, again, the discrete concepts, one God versus many gods, certain rites and rituals unique to Judaism and Christianity, of course, those are there. But there's this sort of common moral consensus that we have here that is completely different from a stark break that this reading that we get from a certain interpretation of Nietzsche would indicate. It's just not there. Furthermore, if we want to look at the Viking sagas, one saga that I read relatively recently was Egil's saga, and one of the key characters in it was a man named Ehrenbjorn, who was a friend of Egil, King Athelstan of England, and the King of Norway. I think it was King Harold. And his basic role in the story was to be basically a diplomat, making sure that everybody more or less got along, even though the typical rough edges and conflicts of Dark Age North Sea would bring people to, murderous violence. Again, that's consistent with what we find in the Bible. Blessed are the peacemakers. And Ehrenbjorn is held up as one of the great friends of Egil and one of the great men of the saga. And so he's contrasted with the more traditional violent Viking is a verb means to raid, character of Egil. But again, it's not all or nothing. And I think also, like a lot of what we read in the Old Testament, with a lot of these violent and horrible events happen, they are being described, but I don't think it means that they should be read. They are descriptive rather than prescriptive in many cases. So the fact that Agamemnon and Achilles have this falling out is descriptive rather than prescriptive. I think also the sort of, obviously Oedipus is descriptive and not prescriptive. And so looking at this, we're going to have this idea that, well, no, you really shouldn't be doing this. Now, even if we look at, say, the idea that Bronze Age paganism has this more, elan vital about, the physical world and whatnot. There's another problem here, right? What happens when you die in Homer? If you read the Odyssey, you become a ghost. You go into Hades. There's no more body. So for all this talk about the body, you lose it and you never get it back. Whereas in the Christian tradition, you're resurrected with a new body. So which exactly has a more this world physical focus? One where you die and you're a ghost for the rest of your life, which is not inconsistent with Plato. Plato also believes that you're essentially a spirit. At the end of his death dialogues, he basically says he'll go to Hades and argue with Agamemnon. So, he has a view of the afterlife very similar to Homer. It's a view of the afterlife that is entirely spiritual. There's no physical body and you're not going to get one back. We see the same thing in the Aeneid. When Aeneas goes into the underworld, we don't see this. And again, Aeneas has a dalliance with Dido, which is bad in two ways. One, it's catastrophic because it leads to at least in Virgil's telling, the Punic War, the enmity between Rome and Carthage. It also leads to him being distracted from his divine mission of finding a new home for his people. And so we see that again, this gets you into trouble. It's not something that you can just do with impunity like some sort of macho man and get away with it. I mean, the gods are running out of patience. Like, Aeneas, come on, hurry up. We've got something to do here. And it's not you, hanging out with Dido in a cave. So what we see with this is that the basic, I think, argument here is a lot of these people balk at Christian sexual ethics and Christian ethics in general. And while certainly pagans in some regards were looser, it wasn't like no rules at all. I mean, going around stealing other men's wives is bad. It's going to lead to the fall of your kingdom, like Troy. It's going to lead to you, well, not necessarily stealing his wife, but, having an affair with Dido is going to lead to a future conflict between Rome and Carthage. It's going to be catastrophic for both sides. And so the issue here is that you could do that because of your strength, your prowess, your wiliness, whatever. But it's not something that you should do. And again, it's not like, Homer and Sophocles are just saying, oh yeah, this is totally great, bro. So there's that angle there. And I think it's also important to talk about the little guy, right? So this idea that the little guy, so in Christianity, and especially Christianity, but even in Judaism, we see this focus on the poor, on the weak and the vulnerable, and that you should not use your strength or your knowledge or your riches to abuse them. But this is something that we also see with Homer, right? So for example, you shouldn't, Ulysses says that you shouldn't, take advantage of somebody who's, lost, somebody who's a stranger, somebody who's vulnerable. And he uses that as his, a petition to the king of the Phocians. Where he returns to Ithaca and he drives out the suitors. There's two, basically what we would call proletarians who are loyal to him. One is called, he's just named by the profession, the swineherd. And there was some other guy, I don't remember his name. But what he does is he rewards them for their loyalty. And he basically makes them minted men. He gives them property, a home, a wife, livestock. He rewards those who were loyal to him, and he doesn't look down on them because of their low birth, right? He has a sense of noblesse oblige to them in a way that we would see not completely out of place in the Middle Ages, with a noble house having this sort of attitude towards their own class of peasants and whatnot. And we also see with, let's say, Hercules, right? Hercules, among other things, he gives, of course, a lot of these acts of outrage or lust or violence are attributed to madness by the gods, right? So Paris, it's his whole thing starts with the three apples, where Venus, Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera all ask him, who's the most beautiful goddess, and they each give him a gift. Venus gives him the most beautiful woman, which is Helen. Hera gives him power, and Athena offers him wisdom. And of course, he chooses Aphrodite, which of course is catastrophic for the Trojans. Now, of course, his poor decision is sort of explained away because that it's the girdle of Aphrodite that is irresistible even to Zeus himself, because in the Iliad, Hera uses it to seduce Zeus so that she can get revenge on the Trojans. So it's sort of like, it's a cop-out kind of thing. And then we see with Hercules, his own madness is inflicted by Hera, who's mad at Zeus's philandering, where he kills his wife and children. Then he has to go on the quests in order to sort of atone for this, sort of undo this. And again, we see that his constant philandering leads to a really bad end, because one of the women who's trying to gain his affection, or rather not lose it, and avoid being left out, takes this garment which is coated with Hydra's poison, which was given to her by an enemy of Hercules in order to bring him down. And basically, he's immortal, so he can't really die, but he's in constant unending pain, so Zeus translates him to Mount Olympus. So this is, it's portraying these things with maybe somewhat supernatural or exaggerated consequences, but in a way that is far more authentic than, say, Howard and subsequent pulp would do it. And this is really the problem here. a lot of this is just a cartoon, right? These people haven't read Homer. They haven't read Sophocles. They don't read the Greek myths. They don't really know what the Bronze Age was like. What they do is they look at cartoons. They look at Howard, and they look at that, and they say, well, that's cool, even though Conan takes place, I think, in the Stone Age. But regardless, or Tarzan from Edgar Rice Burroughs, or Barsoom with John Carter. And they'll be like, well, we want to be able to do that. Well, you can't. It's a cartoon. You never could do that. The kinds of characters that, say, Conan, John Carter, and Tarzan represent, if we were to look back in classical and earlier archetypes who do those things, they suffer consequences that you never see in the pulp fiction. And so I think the real issue here is that this is not inconsistent with what we would find in later Western development of ethical morals. It's arguably, you could say it's deficient in some regards from, say, the point of view of the Platonic philosophers or Christianity, but it's starting from a certain point, right? So, for example, Paul says that the knowledge of God is placed in the hearts of all men. So from a Christian point of view, one would expect a minimum set of moral, ethical principles that we find in these traditions. Obviously, there's going to be some confusion. It's not going to be fully developed. That's not really the point, but we would expect to find some, and we do. And with the, Socratic philosophers, they ultimately, what we see here is a shift from what we might call thumos or spiritedness, which marks the heroic warrior ethos, to reason, which is, the rational element. And so we can even see an elevating of reason within the classic in the Homer's literature and classical literature with Apollo, who is knowledge, and Athena, who is wisdom. And of course, Ulysses makes it back to Ithaca because he cultivates wisdom and knowledge. He's a patron of Athena and Apollo. So he's not even the strongest of the Greek heroes. But the strongest of the Greek heroes is Achilles and Ajax the Greater, Ajax the Lesser, and Patroclus. But it's yet he's the one that comes home and more or less has a happy ending. So we see that if you go into excess with thumos, it leads to disaster. But whereas if you cultivate reason and wisdom, then you make it home. And so that's not inconsistent at all with, say, the teachings, the sort of, it's a germ from which you can get Socratic thought, Platonic thought, where, you have Plato's chariot where reason controls the spirit and the appetites. We can see the good advice of Nestor ignored by Agamemnon and Menelaus. In the Sophoclean cycle, or the Oedipus cycle, we can see the good advice of, I think it's Thersites, ignored by Oedipus. Ignored by Oedipus and then by Creon. Oedipus ignores it when he says, you don't want to know the truth about what went down because, it's going to be really bad. And he's like, I want to know. And of course, he learns all the things that he did in ignorance and then, tears out his eyes. And then Creon ignores the advice as well, and his house is ruined. His son commits suicide. His wife commits suicide. Again, wisdom is ignored. And it's also not true that Plato himself denigrated spirit or thumos, or even Socrates. For example, Socrates fought at the Battle of Delium in 424 BC. And Xenophon, he's the other biographer of Socrates, takes a more what we would call thumic approach, right? Talks about his martial prowess, his physical education. So again, it's not that Socrates even ignored or completely wrote that off. It's just part of the problem is a lot of people just read Plato over Xenophon. But to have a complete picture of Socrates, you need to read both. And even Plato himself in the Republic mentioned the importance of physical exercise for the guardians who would defend the Callipolis. So again, it's as you climb the ladder of ethics, you don't kick out the lower rungs, right? So let's use an analogy here. So Plato gives us the idea of the tripartite soul, where you have a chariot. You have the charioteer who represents reason, and the chariot he's driving has two horses, the white horse and the black horse. The white horse represents spirit, thumos, that sort of warrior spirit, impetuousness, And then the black horse represents desire, sexual desire, desire for money, gain, honor, all these things. And you have to use the charioteer of reason to control the two. And so you climb the ladder. You don't get rid of the two below the charioteer, but things get in trouble if you switch places with the charioteer. And so, for example, also, if we look at the Greek concept of eros, we can apply the tripartite soul here as well, so that you have the black horse of appetite, which would be, say, sexual desire. Then you've got the white horse, which is what I would call wanderlust, the desire for exploration. We see this a lot with the Greek traveling myths. Like obviously Ulysses is a travelogue, Aeneas is a travelogue, as well as Jason and the Argonauts is a travelogue. And then we have the highest level of eros of reason, which is, the desire for knowledge, which the Platonists get to. So you could arguably say that the Platonists are building upon and then going higher up the ladder of this desire to give birth to something. And we see the idea of eros is giving birth to ideas in the Symposium and the Theaetetus, where he talks about midwifing ideas. So I don't think this is inconsistent. It's building upon. It's the process of ratiocination, where you build upon this and get to the next level. And once we look at, say, the sort of, let's look at Paul, right? Because I know Nietzsche really doesn't like Paul. But look at Paul's household code, like in Ephesians. He takes a fairly, by today's standards, an extremely radical position, which at the time was not inconsistent with norms of filial piety that you would find in other situations. It's not that because you have a higher commitment to God that you then don't have a commitment to your family. That's a modern invention. You don't kick out the rungs that you climbed up the ladder with. So seeing that, you have to realize that this isn't really the break. Now, then the other question is this desirable? Maybe you could say, well, okay, maybe it's not a strict break, but, Plato and Paul are kind of like limp-wristed and, we're not going to win. They're not fun, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you look at the unending turmoil and chaos of classical, Sophocles and Homer and others talking about the age of heroes in ancient Greece. Part of the problem was just getting along. Agamemnon and the other Greeks had a hard time getting along, which was seen as a bad thing. It was a bad thing, but it was something that was difficult to manage at the time. So part of what we're dealing here with is conflict resolution amongst an in-group. It's not really easy to do in this early stage. We see a lot of infighting with the Greeks in Troy. A lot of the Greeks come home and they have a bad end, like Agamemnon. And so is this really a desirable outcome? Is this really a desirable status quo? Do we really want to go back to that? I don't think so. And if we look at, say, the development that Plato gives us and the development that Christianity gives us, we find better ways of getting along with each other. So the first one is the in-group, but then also the out-group. Because if you look at the Trojan War, it's fairly ambiguous who actually wins. Because, the Troy is destroyed, but from the point of view of the Romans and Virgil, it gives birth to the new Troy, Rome, which then is greater than the old. And many of the Greeks come home to a bad end. And even those that do come home to a good end, like Menelaus and Ulysses, it's mixed. It's ambiguous. It's not some if you look at the end of the Trojan War, you don't have this sense of confidence and self-importance that you would say with a certain Western narratives of World War II, right? We won it. It's over. It's almost like a hagiography, which is something that we don't actually see with the classical sources here. It's not really hagiographic at all. It's much more ambiguous. And again, I think we need to understand what little hints Homer's giving us, right? Wisdom, Athena, knowledge, Apollo, say that Ares is the bane of man. Okay, that's interesting. War is the bane of man. And then Menelaus is it wasn't really worth it. He basically says it. It's again, that's the sequel, if you will, to the Iliad. And so when you circle this all around, it's what exactly is the message here? And I think it's more ambiguous than these people would like to make. And then, so dealing with the outgroup, what would have been would there have been a better way to deal with Troy, where Troy's not destroyed, or the Greeks don't lose all their treasure and lives and fleets in this expedition? Again, that's an open question too, because it's sort of seen as fated because certain gods have lined up in this sort of like squaring off mashup, where, well, they just wanted to destroy certain people. Like, for example, Poseidon wanted to destroy Troy, as did Hera, and it was just kind of happen. But again, that's also where I think Christianity differs, and even some of the philosophers differ, is that you would have choice. So this kind of like fatalism, that you don't have a choice. See, that's kind of bizarre, right? Because this Nietzschean neo-pagan reading about the will to power is all about you and your choices. But under Bronze Age thinking, metaphysics, you don't make choices, or rather, you make constrained choices, right? The choices you make are sometimes not even your fault, because the gods made you mad, or the gods tricked you. So it's like, well, you can't really, the idea of choices and the importance of choices we see coming out of the Christian tradition, less so the Bronze Age tradition of literature, where a lot of it's just given up to the fates or predestined. And so we see that as well with classical motifs as well. And of course, even the ancients themselves didn't love war as an end in itself. When the Roman Empire consolidated the Mediterranean, using all of these legends together, they weave the story of Aeneas, and the idea that the new Rome would unite the ancient world in peace, because that was the goal, even for the pagans. And the real question is how to get there. How do you get people to get along with the in-group and limit in-group conflict? And how do you get along with people in the out-group and limit out-group conflict? And we see this struggle accounted for in all of these myths and legends. So Virgil and Homer and Sophocles, and others to lesser or greater degrees. In fact, one of the greatest heroes, Theseus, is one who is known for his wisdom and justice, and who's able to adjudicate conflicts rather than cause them. Now, of course, he's also famous as a warrior who fought the Amazons and stole their queen Hippolyta. But the point is, though, what makes Theseus such a important hero of this period is that he's one who's more, well, okay, Athens is the patron city of Athena, wisdom. So yeah, okay, of course he's going to be, if he's like the founder of Athens, he's going to be known for his wisdom. Hence, having Athena be the patron goddess. But we see that he is one of the heroes that is able to deal with this problem, right? So in Oedipus at Colonna, he meets Theseus, and Theseus says, "Yeah, Creon is coming after you, trying to steal not Antigone, but his other daughter, to bait him out. But I'll protect you and respect the gods and give you due reverence as a king." And that treatment from Theseus is what gives him a good ending, whereas the two sons of Oedipus, who did not fulfill their filial duty, both die in a civil war. And so we see that this drive to use wisdom and knowledge as a way to overcome the passion and desires and appetites that cause men to fight, which we find in James, is also found in the classical tradition and in stories of the Bronze Age heroes. So again, ultimately, the idea that you use wisdom and insight and knowledge to control your appetites, to rise above petty squabbling in order to maintain peace amongst the in-group and get along with people in the out-group, is something we find in Homer and Sophocles describing the heroes of the Greek Golden Age. And so what I would argue, again, is there's not a clear break. There's not a clear distinction. It's a process of development where you see that through the process of reflection on these stories, other experiences, infusion of new ideas from the Levant with Christianity, we see that this becomes more consolidated. And the idea being that you use wisdom to control your appetites so that you don't get into all these fixes that everybody else did. Now, there is still some ambiguity here, because Ulysses does some pretty dodgy stuff, right? He lies to I forget the name of the guy, but there was some guy that was at the beginning of the voyage to Troy, was left on an island, who had the arrows of Hercules, which was considered to be a good omen that once was retrieved would lead to the fall of Troy. So Basically, Ulysses tricks him and then, gets him to give up the arrows of Hercules without actually leaving the island. And Achilles' son Neoptolemus thinks that's dishonorable, but goes along with it anyhow because the war is going on too long. And of course, the Romans are no fan of Ulysses. The deceptive Greeks is a common refrain that they have. So again, it's not fully developed. Not lying is not necessarily a huge thing for the Greeks. But even Plato's okay with lying. You read the Republic, you have to have the noble lie to get people in line. But we also see, though, that Ulysses lying also does get him into trouble too. So it's a double-edged sword. He's clever, he's wily, but he's not necessarily good. And so, arguably, the most noble hero of the Iliad is Hector. He's a family man. He's defending his country, his homeland. Obviously, there's this sort of like tragic fate. He's predestined to die. But he comes off as one of the most admirable characters in the story. And again, this is an enemy of the Greeks. So Homer is willing to create authentic opponents for the Greeks, right? Again, you go back to the cartoons of E.O. Howard or Robert Howard. Conan just fights, basically the equivalent of Star Trek of red shirts. They're just whoever. They're nobody. They're just red shirts. Whereas, Homer creates, real flesh and blood human beings that the Greeks square off against. Some of whom are noble and honorable, right? So, again, there's that. So let's start looking here at comments. We have a lot. I will start with the super chats. So we have Ori Samsonov, 20 shekels. Cheers. Thank you, Ori. Much appreciated. Let's see if we have any more supers before we go on. Okay, none. So let's see here. What do we got? Minoan. Okay, not me, not you. Really enjoyed the last stream, but don't despair. Those of us here in the meat space making changes don't have time to make content. We're out there and we're rebuilding community. Well, that's good to hear. Kids need to be named Agamemnon again, Minoan. Well, in America, they used to name people after classical and Bronze Age and myth heroes all the time. So, yeah, there's definitely that. John Comanus. There's people still named Zeus and Cleomenes, for instance. Hippocrates, too. I've even seen a Hercules. Yeah, I think amongst Greeks, you might see more of that, or Eastern Europeans. Let's see here. What else do we got? Lots of stuff here. Huh. It's always the wife who won't do what? Oh, okay, it was something else. Never mind. Okay, more about names. Let's see, anything else here? Names. Kaya Makata, the Bible is pretty cool, NGL. Yes, it is. Here we go. A Minoan, don't name your kid Antigone. No one will pronounce it correctly. I think they could probably pronounce it correctly if you teach them how. Okay, let's see more naming conventions. Anglo-Saxon names. Yes, Vingel. Aaron Bjorn is a great name. There we go. Us Greeks name our children after our fathers, for instance. Yeah, Russian has the same, and the Scandinavians have a similar naming convention. So, SSON, son, means the son of, in Norwegian. So you'll see that. Or I think SOV, Sov, means son of in Slavic, so Russians will have that. Let's see, more names. Oh, yeah, Big Brain, hello. See that you're here. Howdy, isn't this channel fantastic? Well, as the one who runs this channel, I agree. Vingel, yes, it is fantastic. I'm going to exit chat and listen to the rest with some focus. Okay. Seems the best ones have read Clausewitz. I don't know who exactly you're talking about here, but I would agree. Clausewitz is a great read. Yeah, yeah, Iron Duke. There are plenty of good morals in the ancient world. Yeah, that's the thing that's interesting, especially if you read Plutarch's Noble Lives. Plutarch goes into a lot of discussion about the ethical. I mean, he's an honest historian, not like modern day hagiographies of U.S. presidents. He points out the good and the bad of many characters, but he emphasizes the good qualities of these Greek and Roman personages in order to educate people on moral behavior. And of course, Plutarch himself is a Platonist, and he starts it with semi legendary figures of Theseus for the Greeks, Athenians, and the Roman. It escapes me at the moment, but one of the founders, Romulus, the founder of Rome. And yeah, he does point out this heroic quality in them, and as a Platonist, he doesn't discount the prowess of Theseus. So one interesting anecdote I think about a good morals in the ancient world is in Proverbs, Solomon says, "A man who controls his spirit is better than he who can take a city." And I think what's interesting here is that there's actually in Plutarch's Life of Camillus, who's a Roman from around the 4th century BC, fighting a neighboring city called the Philarii, we see that he actually achieves both. So it's like the why not both meme. So the city, one of the tutors of the noble's children, led them astray to the Roman camp in order to offer them as hostages, in order to then use that as leverage to bring the city down to destruction. And one of the things that Camillus does, he says, well, this is a dishonorable way to take the city. So he arrests the man, strips him naked, and has the students whip him with sticks back to the city. Upon seeing this, according to Plutarch, the leaders of the city say that, well, the Romans are such noble and integrous people that we would rather be allies to them and voluntarily submit. So on the one hand, he doesn't take a shortcut, by taking hostages under deceit and deception, and he takes the city. So there's this sort of interesting connection that you have here, if you know where to look for it. Let's see, where else we got Varangian Guard here. A lot of stuff about the Varangian Guard. Let's see. Where do we start here? Oh, Harold Hardrada. Yeah, Harold Hardrada did serve in the Varangian Guard. He worked for the Byzantines and literally and figuratively made a killing and retired back to Norway. And then he tried to claim the throne of England and it didn't turn out too well for him. Let's see. Minoan, the liberal Western thought that we are at the pinnacle of ethical and moral life just pisses me off. Yeah, it does me too. I mean, if you actually read, the ancient sources and know how to read them too, right? Yeah, it becomes clear that a lot of this is woefully misunderstood. And with all of the externalities that are developing in modern society as it creaks away to collapse, it's pretty clear that this alleged superiority isn't quite what it was cracked up to be. Okay, let's see. More. I'll never figure out how chats can get so far astray from the episode. We're talking about Harold Hardrada, the Vikings, and the Varangian Guard. The Minoan, the Greeks could have imposed sanctions on Troy instead. Possibly, but Troy could have traded with the heartland of Asia Minor, which would have been hard for the Greeks to block off. So I don't know about that. John Comanus, they weren't as bad as the Praetorian Guard, but the Varangians had their quirks. Much more loyal than the Varangians. Yes, that's true. They were much more loyal to the cause of the emperor. Okay, let's see. Yeah, the one thing that's interesting about the Varangians is with the rise of knights and Normanism, specifically with the Normans in Sicily, Robert Guiscard and his dynasty especially I think it's the Battle of Dyrrhachium in the 1080s. They really are on the back foot. Mounted lancers are more than a match for axemen. You need more of a traditional phalanx formation to deal with that. Let's see here. When would you be willing to do a video on seed oils and other aspects of the American diet? Well, that's certainly a very important topic to discuss. I don't know if I feel fully qualified to engage in that. That's something I know personally very well as far as what damage it can do, but yeah. Well, so K14Y29, why were the Greeks known as duplicitous? Is there some truth to this? Well, I mean, first of all, the Romans, are salty about Ulysses and the Trojan horse, right? And so he just his sort of deceptive qualities are admitted to by Homer. In fact, when Ulysses returns to Ithaca and meets Athena, they both try to out deceive each other, which is kind of a game. It's kind of pointless. They both know who they are, and then also, of course, Plato doesn't place a preeminence on truth. He says that you should have the noble lie. You should lie to the people to tell them that they are born of baser metals in order to know their place in society. So this is definitely something we see from the Romans, and it's something that, and again, you see it extended in the Middle Ages, because again with the Divine Comedy, we see this as well. This idea that the Greeks are duplicitous. I guess if you have an entire case-by-case basis, look at all the accounts of Greeks throughout classical history, you might get a somewhat different, and it depends on the Greeks too, right? Another example of duplicity was Sparta. I think it was during the Peloponnesian War. They offered freedom to a bunch of Helots if they decided to volunteer and fight against the Athenians. And then they were summarily executed. And the Spartan commander told everybody else, oh, well, those are the troublemakers. Those are the ones that would have risen up if we had turned our backs on them. And I'm like, wow, that's really cold-blooded. So I think we have actually quite a few examples throughout history of the Greeks being a little dodgy with the truth. Let's see here. We have another super chat from Youth in Asia for $10. Thank you. Really enjoying the casual streams. Thanks for the interesting topics. Well, yeah, exactly. I'm glad you enjoy it. And I'm going to try to put these into the Monday, Tuesday slot. A lot of the people in our circles are active Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. My channel isn't quite big enough to really compete with them on those days, and they'd probably just, sort of take over, right? They would be the ones that take over. So I think really right now it's good to find a niche where there aren't really a lot of competition for time, and people, of course, have the time to watch. See here, Minoan. Youth in Asia. I always listen to Todd's streams twice as they're info dense. Well, thank you, Minoan. I'm glad you watched them twice. Let's see. Those dodgy Greeks. Yeah, and we see this in the Middle Ages too, with the Byzantine Empire. Like if you read the Strategicon by Maurice, you definitely see that he places a premium on stratagems, which would be perceived as deceptive and dishonorable by other warrior traditions. And so, you could argue that, well, as Aeschylus said, the law sleeps in war. So you could say that, well, it's war. We're gonna do that. Of course, other groups will be like, well, no, we don't want to have this race to the bottom, where we just have the worst kinds of behavior possible. The Greek mindset hasn't really changed, though. Greeks still, yes, and that's also true now. It's true for Italians as well. They don't like each other either. With the Renaissance, infighting between the city-states and continued conflict in that regard. So let's see. Youth in Asia. Who is your favorite ancient strategist? Well, favorite, probably Scipio Africanus. And if anybody wants to see more on that, you can watch my History of Warfare episode, Studies in Command, where I compare. Let me see. We didn't get to Caesar yet, but I think we do talk about Caesar. We covered Pyrrhus, Hannibal, Alexander, and Scipio. Right, we covered those guys. I don't think we covered Caesar. We compared them, and I think Scipio comes out the greatest because in tactics, operations, and strategy, as well as diplomacy, he's excellent. He's a match for Hannibal in the military arts, and he's a diplomatic wizard. Stripping away Carthage's Celtic allies, Numidian allies. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any other ancient commander as competent and talented until Julius Caesar. So I think that I would say that. Let's see. Brett McLean. Ulysses also wins Hector's armor with eloquence. Yes. Which could be construed as a form of trickery, while Ajax saved the Greek ships from burning. Yeah, he throws the big boulder and uses a pike. So also, fun fact, the phalanx, the Macedonian phalanx of Philip, was inspired by the reading of the Odyssey, and in part, Ajax used the pike. So let's see here. Youth in Asia. It was interesting to hear about Pyrrhus. Yeah. I guess if you're referring to one of my streams, then yeah, it is. Too bad. Yes. Video game strategy 101. Don't you know that elephants and tanks have debuffs in cities? Minoan. I have an odd anger that Rome wiped Carthage off the map, even though Carthage was probably evil in its child sacrifice. There is a certain sense of loss with Carthage, especially with the rise of the Barcas, because I think with the Barcas we're beginning to see a sort of Hellenistic monarchy rise in Spain as a counterpart to the merchant class. So what's interesting is that had the Barcas won the Second Punic War and consolidated power, we might, when they say, well, we'd have had like the merchant class Carthaginians take over. Well, it wouldn't have been them. It'd have been the Barcas, and they were more of an aristocratic military attempting to build a Hellenistic monarchy, which I think is the best reading of that. Let's see. All right, guys. Well, I think I'm going to wrap this stream up. Thanks, everyone, for watching. And, yeah, if you have any recommendations for future concepts for the casual stream, check me out on Locals, and you can make some recommendations there. Good night, everyone, and thanks for your interest and support.